Ian Murray.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Crosbie. Can I personally congratulate the member for Edinburgh East in his victory at the general election. It was a stunning victory, and I miss my colleague Sheila Gilmore, who I wish well, but it was a victory, and I congratulate him on that victory. Mr Crosbie, it's a great pleasure to be speaking on our amendments to this bill as it makes its way through the House, and I couldn't help but noticing in the gallery earlier, Mr Crosbie, Lionel Richie was there, and I hope he enjoyed our debate, the first part of our debate, as much as we enjoy his music. These committee days are really important to ensure that the Smith Agreement in this House is delivered in full, as we said consistently at second reading, in both spirit and indeed in substance. It's also essential to ensure that we go further than the Smith Agreement, as we've said consistently on this side of the House, and set out a number of clear improvements. Scotland has had an in-depth and passionate debate about its future and concluded that a fair and more prosperous Scotland is best delivered by shared tax and spending across the UK, but with Scotland taking more control over the levels of tax and spending, alongside, of course, greater accountability. If anyone was under any illusions that the centre of political gravity in Scotland was not at Holyrood, and I agree with the member for Perth and North Perthshire when he said this, if anybody is under any illusions that the centre of political gravity in Scotland was not at Holyrood, then they are not grasping the modern political landscape in Scotland. That is why the sections of this bill we are debating today, and the amendments that we have brought forward, recognising the Scottish Parliament as the seat of political power and the catalyst for change in Scotland, and there are amendments to the bill attempt to deliver that change. There is a big responsibility on us all, but in the end, what is much more important is the debate about how powers are used rather than where those powers lie, and we have tried to tease some of those out in interventions today without much success. Clause 1 of the bill conveys the permanency of the Scottish Parliament as an institution. We agree that this is a critical part of ensuring its permanency, its integral part of Scottish life, but have amendments to improve the bill beyond where the Smith Commission proposed. As I said last week in the second reading of this bill is the latest staging post in what has been a long, sometimes arduous, but always exciting devolution journey. As a passionate believer in the principle of devolution and delivering a strong and vibrant Scottish Parliament, I hope this staging post delivers the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world. Our journey began, of course, with the Scotland Act of 1998, drafted and delivered by a Labour government and crowned by Donald Dure's now infamous pronouncement, "There shall be a Scottish Parliament." Further steps we have taken along our devolution journey have only served to enhance the Scottish Parliament's potential. The Calman Commission on Further Devolution, the recommendation of which were codified in the Scotland Act of 2012, transferred further powers and placed the Parliament on a firmer footing. Then came last year's referendum, when the people of Scotland voted decisively to remain part of the United Kingdom. However, I'm happy to give way.
At the time of the referendum, of course, the yes side, the independent side, included full fiscal autonomy. Post the vow, the no side were also including full fiscal autonomy. So what has changed since the referendum that's made the no side resile from that point? The point of the vow was near to federalism as possible, which would have included full fiscal autonomy. And why does he now want to leave those powers in the hands of the Tories at Westminster rather than the Parliament of the Scots in Edinburgh?
Well, there's a very simple answer to that question, Mr Crosbie. We all want what's best for Scotland, and I'll just come on to the latter part of my speech. The latter part of my speech in terms of how full fiscal autonomy would be bad for Scotland in terms of all the information that we've got here. And, Mr Crosbie, we can either have a sensible debate in this chamber about what are fundamental principles about people's lives and livelihoods in Scotland, or we can have a political knockaround about who votes with who prefers who, and who said what to who in terms of a referendum debate. This is critically important, this bill, for the future livelihoods of Scotland. And if all we can get from the benches behind us is simple party point scoring, then we'll get no further forward in terms of trying to improve this bill. And to answer the honourable gentleman's question directly, the reason we're here today is because the vow put together the Smith Agreement, which the 5 political parties of which the SNP was represented on that Smith Commission have come forward with proposals which are now in this bill, and we want to take this bill a little bit further. I keep emphasising that, and I consistently emphasise that at second reading. I'm going to make a little bit of progress, but I will come back to the honourable gentleman, if he so wishes, a little bit later. However, and this emphasises the point from that intervention, Mr Crosbie, as we said in the Labour Party at the time, and as we said many times since, the no vote at the referendum was not a vote for no change. Labour played an active part in the Smith Commission, the recommendations of which brings us to where we stand today, considering this bill. It was a compromise position, and with all good compromises, there will be some things that you gain and some things that you lose. I hope and believe that it will strike the right balance, affording the Scottish Parliament the power to make a real difference to people's lives, while ensuring that Scotland remains part and secure in the United Kingdom. So let me I'll give way to your honourable friend who was actually in before you.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Will you not accept that the Scottish people voted overwhelmingly for the Scottish National Party in the general election on the 7th of May. 56 members of Parliament sent to this chamber. The express view of the Scottish people that we want home rule. Home rule that Gordon Brown talked about prior to the referendum. Why doesn't he accept that Labour lost the general election in Scotland because they were out of tune with the Scottish people? And it's about time they started to listen to what the people in Scotland want and deliver it.
Well, it seems to me that the Scottish National Party, in their fantastic victory, which I've complimented them and congratulated on a number of occasions from the dispatch box, don't seem to want to have any scrutiny at all. Just because they've come forward with their proposal for full fiscal autonomy doesn't mean to say that we should not scrutinise that proposal. And in actual fact, if it wasn't for the honourable member for Gainsborough, the right honourable member for Gainsborough, we probably wouldn't be even discussing full fiscal autonomy today, because he forced the hand of the Scottish National Party to bring forward their manifesto commitment that we're lowing back on incredibly quickly. Let me move to new clause 2 and move new clause 2, Mr. Crosbie. I'd like to start by moving on new clause 2 and the other amendments in this section. Now, let me just make a little bit of progress. I will give way because the honourable gentleman was generous to me as well. But let me make a little bit of progress. Let me move our new clause 2 and the other amendments in this section in my name and that of my honourable and right honourable friends. In the last couple of years, it's become increasingly apparent that devolution is not just a matter for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also for the rest of England and the United Kingdom as a whole. The Labour movement has always been an engine of reform and the party of devolution. Now, people want to see power devolved and exercised at local level, affording greater decision-making and enhanced accountability. I will give way, but let me make a little bit of progress, because there are people who want to speak on other amendments. But if these ambitions are to be realised, we need to depart from the divisive rhetoric employed during the general election campaign, which set Scots against the English, against one another, and risked tearing the UK apart at the seams. Labour believes in the historic union of the UK nations working together for the common good. However, it's clear that the union now needs to evolve, and that evolution means dispersing power from the centre, from Whitehall and from this Parliament. With devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland continuing apace, this evolutionary process is in danger of becoming lopsided. That is why, had Labour won in May, we would immediately have started to devolve power away from Whitehall, not just to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also to the regions and localities across the United Kingdom. That is because we recognise that regions can and must be given more of a voice in our political process, and that we must find new ways to give further voice to regional and national culture and identity, and crucially without the strings attached that this government have attached. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I apologise to my honourable friend over here. He makes an important point about taking power out of the hands of this place and of the Scottish Parliament and giving it to local communities. Some of his other friends in his own benches have made the same point. Why then did Labour-controlled Glasgow City Council continue to act as a roadblock against our piece of legislation in the Scottish Parliament? I see him rolling his eyes and chuntering to his mate beside him. Why are they against our bill in the Scottish Parliament to give power to local communities through the Scottish Parliament? Why is Labour such a roadblock in Glasgow?
Sir Crosbie, I'm not unsure of the entire detail of the proposal that the honourable gentleman is putting forward, but there is a general consensus across Scotland that the Scottish Parliament has been one of the most centralist parliaments in the world by grappling away power from local government. And what we're trying to do as part of this bill, which I think is a major positive, and I hope the government... Well, if you would allow me to answer the previous intervention first. If you're a seasoned professional in this chamber, the member for Dundee East, allow at least me to get halfway through the intervention from the other honourable gentleman. One of the key things, and I hope the Treasury Bench and the Secretary of State do look at some of these principles in terms of this bill, is whether or not we go much further in terms of double devolution, because there's no point in just sending powers from one Parliament to another. Those powers also have to be spread across Scotland and local authorities from Holyrood into local authorities as well. And if you don't have that process, then you can't take power closer to the people that you seek to represent. I will give way to the honourable gentleman. I'll come to the honourable Leigh. Well, you can blame your boss if you like, but he wants to come in first.
The honourable gentleman has suggested about 10 minutes ago that somehow the Scottish National Party weren't going to bring forward an amendment to deliver full fiscal autonomy, and he suggested it only happened because of the honourable gentleman for Gainsborough's amendment. That, of course, is completely false. Amendment 89 is on the order paper to deliver full fiscal autonomy. So can the Labour front bench withdraw that daft allegation and, more importantly, confirm they intend to go through the lobbies with the Tory front bench to stop power coming to Scotland?
Wonderful, Mr Crosbie. We're now being accused of not voting with the Tories but voting with the Tory front bench, while the SNP troops through the lobby with the most right-wing Conservatives on the other side of the chamber. It's incredible. And if you were so keen, well, the honourable member for Dundee East is now not listening to the answer. Now he's insisted on the intervention. But the key point here in terms of the amendment is if you were so keen on full fiscal autonomy before you put down clause 89, you could just have countersigned new clause 3. The honourable member for Gainsborough. I'm happy to give way.
My amendment gives what they say they want straight away, while theirs is a bit of a fudge and slightly kicks in the long grass. It's a bit like St Augustine saying, "Let me stop sinning, but not quite yet."
It reminds me, what do we want? Full fiscal autonomy. When do we want it? We're not quite sure, I think, is the summing up of their... and I'll give way to the honourable lady, because I was rude.
I just wanted to ask the honourable gentleman if he agrees with me that the powers in the Smith Commission and the powers in this bill are utterly inadequate. And by way of illustration, I would point out to him that the Scottish Parliament doesn't even have feeble enough powers to ban parking on pavements. Such is the lack of teeth of the Scottish Parliament, and the powers presented in the Smith Commission and in this bill are utterly inadequate. And further, does he agree with me that all power should be devolved to Scotland unless there is a compelling reason to reserve that power at Westminster?
Well, the honourable lady is right. There is a deficiency in terms of parking on pavements, and I think all honourable members have been lobbied about trying to change that in the bill. We'll be bringing forward amendments. You're very welcome to sign our amendment if you wish, in terms of be able to do that. I'm sorry, do you want to... No, sorry. Mr Crosbie, let me make a little bit of progress, and hopefully we can bring some... let me give this commitment, Mr Crosbie. If the honourable lady brings an amendment forward on parking on pavements, we will sign it. So there's a commitment that if she wants to do that. Mr Crosbie, I was talking about new clause 2. Let me just tell you a little bit about why we brought new clause 2 in terms of the Constitutional Convention, in terms of the practical steps we need to take so that, where appropriate and desirable, decisions are taken as close to communities as they possibly can. Our new clause proposes that members of the Constitutional Convention must include members of the public, which is the key part of any constitutional convention, elected representatives from across all levels of government, including this place, and of course local government, representatives of civic society organisations, and in an advisory role, of course, academia as well. What we cannot have is a Prime Minister and government cooking up a devolution settlement in a back room of the Cabinet Office without proper recourse to the public. And as I said at second reading, the Prime Minister's cat-handed approach to the way he dealt with the post-Scottish referendum landscape has in itself threatened the very viability of the UK that Scots voted to maintain. So let's have a wide-ranging discussion on the constitutional settlement of the whole of the UK. The review undertaken in the recommendations by the Constitutional Committee would include but not be restricted to matters that we've already discussed today: the role of voting rights in this chamber, a democratic reform of the House of Lords, further subnational devolution to England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, votes of course at 16, and codification of the Constitution, which I think is one of the problems that we have in terms of discussing the Scotland Bill about us not having a proper written constitution. Can I turn, Mr Crosbie, if I may, to our amendments 37 and 38 that are very similar in substance to those tabled by the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland. The opening lines of the vow declare that the Scottish Parliament is permanent and extensive new powers of Parliament will be delivered. Equally, the Smith Commission agreement said that UK legislation will state that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are permanent institutions. And as I have said, the centre of political power in Scotland is the Scottish Parliament. It has the power over most things that affect the day-to-day lives of most Scots. But as things stand, and as was noted by the House of Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee, the Scotland Act 1998 stated that there shall be a Scottish Parliament, but did not provide that it be permanent. Nor, on the other hand, does it set out any special procedures or grounds under which it could be dissolved. Would it simply be a repeal of the Scotland Act of 1998? There has been agreement from legal experts that the clause as it stands could be made clearer, more concise and more in keeping with the overall spirit and tenor of the Smith recommendations. For example, the Law Society of Scotland, and I thank the Law Society of Scotland, in particular Michael Clancy, for all his advice on the legalities of these particular clauses, stated that the phrasing in the draft clause does not literally implement the terms of paragraph 21 of the Smith report. The use of the phrase recognise as permanent has a different nuance from the statement that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are permanent institutions.
Okay, well, at that point,
I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Yeah, well, given that the Scottish Parliament, at the insistence of the Labour Party, was founded through the process of a referendum, will he support our clause to ensure that it can't be abolished without a referendum?
Well, Mr Crosbie, I'm absolutely delighted that the honourable gentleman's raised that point, because actually that's exactly what our amendment does as well, and we're very happy for them to sign our amendment, given we had our amendments down on the order paper before the Scottish National Party. But we agree on this. There's no division on this. We need to have a robust devolution architecture. That means making sure that the legal restrictions notwithstanding in the Scotland Bill are removed, so we do have a permanent Scottish Parliament in statute and as well in law and as well as in spirit. Amendment 37 alters Clause 1 by exchanging the indefinite for the definite article in reference to the Scottish Parliament. There is only one Scottish Parliament after all, so there's no need to be a double reference. Amendment 38, meanwhile, adds to Clause 1 the stipulation that the Scottish Parliament and the Act that it is predicated on can only be abrogated with the consent of the Scottish people, given effect by an Act of the Scottish Parliament. That is the referendum section of our particular amendment. I believe this amounts to what is known in constitutional law as contingent entrenchment. Given the time, Mr Crosbie, I won't go through some of the other issues with regards to contingency entrenchment, but I'm sure the Secretary of State realises the views on this side of the House from both parties, in fact all three parties on this side of the House, with regards to the strengthening of Clause 1 and the desire to have a referendum inserted into Clause 1 to ensure that permanency is with regards to the views of the Scottish people in terms of those particular issues. They're very similar to Amendments 58 and 59. Can I just touch on some of the other clauses that we've been debating this evening? My honourable friend for Nottingham North has promoted his constitutional amendments in the expert way he always does, and will bring a great amount of knowledge to these kind of constitutional debates. And to new Clause 3 in the name of the honourable gentleman for Gainsborough, and Clause 89 in the name of the SNP members. New Clause 3 effectively delivers, as the honourable member for Gainsborough has said time and time again, full fiscal autonomy now. Not later, but now. Amendment 89 says that perhaps we should have full fiscal autonomy, but we're not sure, and we don't know when, but to transfer the powers to reserve the right to have that at some point unidentified in the future. Let me be clear at the beginning, Mr Crosbie, that we will not support these two amendments, and they are not in the interests of the Scottish people. New Clause 3 does what it says on the tin. It would deliver the key SNP manifesto promise of full fiscal autonomy at the commencement of this bill. The Labour Party and others always said that the worst-case scenario for Scotland's future would be an SNP group that pushes their promise of full fiscal autonomy and a Conservative majority government that delivers it for them. I'll give way to the Honourable.
I thank the Shadow Secretary for giving way. At the end of this debate, has the Shadow Secretary any inkling whatsoever of at what point the Barnett for Scotland, the Barnett formula calculations for Scotland would actually cease, and the impact of the calculation on the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, the Barnett formula would cease at full fiscal autonomy. As soon as those players were transferred, the Barnett formula would cease. And that's something that I think everyone should be aware of. And the member for North Antrim has consistently during this debate, Mr Crosbie, challenged SNP members to say what is the cost of full fiscal autonomy for the ordinary Scottish person in the street, and we've yet to have an answer. What we've been told is let's get the principle of full fiscal autonomy together and then work out the consequences later. I'm going to press on, but I will come back to you. I will come back to you, but let me press on. It's simple, Mr Crosbie. The pooling and sharing of resources across the UK and the maintenance of the Barnett formula is of benefit to Scotland. The much-quoted Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I know the SNP continually rubbish the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but they've demonstrated beyond argument that full fiscal autonomy would result in Scotland having a deficit of some £7.6 billion. And before the Honourable... I was just about to say, but I will give me 1 second. because I might just answer your question before you ask to intervene. And before the benches next to me pop up and challenge these expert figures, can I get on the record that this is over and above any current UK deficit and UK spending projections? I'm happy to give way tomorrow.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Would the honourable gentleman agree with me that all this talk of black holes with full fiscal autonomy fails to recognise that a black hole exists right now as a result of successful Westminster government policies, a black hole created by policies of successive Tory and Labour governments, and for which the Tories at present are making the poorest and most vulnerable in our society pay. The case that Labour are making out in attacking full fiscal autonomy. Things are so bad that letting the Tories fix the deficit their way is better. I'm going to keep going, so...
Well done.
You would rather...
Amendment should be short, and the House should be tolerant of that. Joanna Cherry.
Would the honourable gentleman agree that his party should have more ambition for Scotland?
Well, Mr Crosbie, this is the nub of the matter, isn't it? Because if you try and scrutinise what would be a devastating policy for Scotland, you are accused of not being ambitious for Scotland. And let me just, for the avoidance of doubt, the £7.6 billion is over and above the UK deficit. I do agree with the Honourable Lady. The Conservative government previously, from 2010 to 2015, made a complete shambles of getting rid of the deficit. They broke all their promises on getting rid of the deficit, and indeed only half the deficit over their period in office from 2010 to 2015. But the actual deficit, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies paper this year, is not £7.6 billion, it's £7.6 billion over and above the current UK deficit, which is £14.2 billion. That's not being ambitious for Scotland. That's warning against a fiscal policy that would be folly for families up and down Scotland in terms of the way it would work out. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman before he busts a blood vessel.
Thanks for giving way. Very, very grateful, the honourable for giving way. It's now clear the policy of his policy, the policy of the Front-Bench Labour Party, is to leave Scotland's taxpayers in the hands of this Tory government. That is very clear. The vow didn't say that, however. The vow included full fiscal autonomy. Will he tell us when he changed his mind?
Mr Crosbie, the Scotland Bill in front of us transfers nearly 50% of tax to the Scottish Parliament and 60% of spending. We promised to make it the most powerful Parliament in the world. It's devolved, and that is a promise that we will keep, as I've always said, to ensure that the bill is delivered in full, in both spirit and indeed in substance, and we will go further as we will debate in this committee stage in the future debates that we have on the days in this House. Can I also just go back to the £7.6 billion deficit? I know they don't like to talk about the £7.6 billion deficit, but it's important to get these on the record, because it's unfortunate that they've consistently misquoted the numbers of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and themselves have had to come out and ask the Scottish National Party to retract what they have said in terms of those numbers. What we didn't hear as well today, Mr Crosbie, was any mention at all of the Office for Budget Responsibility's oil report that they produced last week. This showed that the reliance on oil as an underpinning of the Scottish economy is no longer a viable projection. The collapse in revenues from oil will see tax take from this source drop from £37 billion to just £2 billion over the 20-year period to 2040. That would be catastrophic for Scottish public finances. So the question then becomes, will the SNP vote with the Tories to deliver what they want, as they've said that they will do, or will they finally admit in this House that their flagship policy of full fiscal autonomy is economically illiterate? And there's no better time to go to the honourable member for Dundee East.
The honourable gentleman's being extremely generous indeed. He mentioned the OBR. He will like to confirm, I'm sure, for the sake of completeness, that the OBR themselves said the forecasts were very uncertain, even over the short term. They imply 8 billion billion barrels of oil extracted, rather than the normal industry 14 to 24 billion barrels extracted. And of course the figures they use are contradicted by other expert groups which have higher prices and higher forecast extraction figures.
Well, the honourable member for Dundee East is wasted in this House. Mr Crosbie should be in the City buying and selling futures and oil price shares, I would have thought would be the best way for him to go. The three things that fall from the OBR report is the unpredictability of oil price, the difficulty of extraction in the North Sea, and the fact that, whichever way you look at it, oil revenues are declining quite sharply over the next 20-year period. It would appear that the honourable gentleman... Well, if they wish to intervene, I'm happy to take other intervention, Mr Crosbie, but it's quite clear that they cannot defend their policy for full fiscal autonomy. Indeed, they should listen to their honourable friend, the honourable gentleman for East Lothian, who said it would be economic suicide. He's an experienced journalist, he's an experienced economist, and they would do very well to listen to what he said in terms of full fiscal autonomy. Let me just conclude, Mr Crosbie, in terms of where we are with our amendments. We're looking to push amendment number 38 to the vote because we feel the permanency of the Scottish Parliament should have the underpinning of the Scottish people through any means that would be appropriate, including a referendum. We would like to push new clause 2 to the House in terms of a constitutional convention to try and resolve some of these larger issues around where we are in terms of the constitutional settlement across the country. But one thing that we will do, Mr Speaker, is we will oppose full fiscal autonomy in all its forms, because it's bad for the Scottish people, it's bad for the Scottish economy, and it's bad for the future of Scotland.